Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Claire Schaefer-Olekshak. I'm the Executive Director of Sustain Dane. I'm glad that you're here today for our Sustainable Breakfast Series. Has anybody been talking about the weather lately? 60 degrees in February. Last week was quite a week for talking about the weather. And it's complicated. I will admit, I enjoyed feeling warm sunshine and hearing birds and being outside, having that respite. I also, though, at the same time was feeling this is sad and concerning, and I know that climate change is a part of this, and this is not how I remember the seasons. I grew up in Wisconsin, and February to me is about snow, being really high. I always remember myself being really low and the snow really high. Maybe even some snow days. I don't know. Those don't exist anymore. And the seasons are just different now. The seasons are different. Last week, I also was struck by how much everyone was talking about the weather. And in usual times, that is a go-to for our small talk. Research actually shows that about 60% of people will choose weather for their conversation. In the Midwest, we might be closer to 90%. I'm not sure, maybe Amanda tells us that. But it was, it was in the hallways, and it was at, pickup, and it was for my kids, and it was before meetings. And I guess what really started to crystallize for me is weather might be one of our most powerful entry points into conversations about climate change. The Yale Climate Opinion Survey, says that 73% of people in Dane County are either somewhat or very worried about climate change. At the same time, only 45% of us talk about it occasionally. So I'm wondering if 60% of us are starting with the weather, is there an opportunity here? Can we start thinking about how to maybe gently stretch those conversations into sustainability or climate change and continue to normalize these conversations that the environment matters to us? Maybe even sharing some of the ways that we support the environment. I bike to work today, or I'm planting my pollinator garden because I'm noticing that the seasons are different and I care and I want to do something about it. There's a lot of ways that we observe the weather, every day. And what I guess I've been taking away from the changes that have been happening, especially last week, is thinking about how that observation can move into participating in shaping what's going to come next for us. So I hope you guys are going to be thinking about that and maybe have some ideas too after our program today. Sustain Dane has been around for over 20 years. We help people learn, connect, and take action for sustainability. There are 4 main areas of our programs. First one is education and engagement, like what we're doing today. We also have a number of workshops on different areas related to sustainability. We run the Efficiency Navigator, which is a program focused on affordable housing and energy efficiency. We've been able to help 200 families in Dane County reduce their cost of energy bills, improve their energy efficiency, and the health and safety in their homes. We also focus on waste reduction. We run the free food scrap drop-off sites at farmers markets, and we have a program called Recycle Better. Our last area is on youth leadership, and that includes working with young people in elementary schools, and also the Powerful Teen Leaders program, which focuses on a green job exploration of careers for teens on the north side. I'd like to welcome our new members since we last got together for our Sustainable Breakfast Series. Our new members include Clean Mark, Knoll Development, Common Ground, Sun Prairie School District, Allieri CPA, Madison Liquidators, and 8 individual members. I'd also like to recognize our renewed members since our last SBS. At the forest level, that includes Focus on Energy, MG&E, and Reynolds Transfer and Storage. At the tree level, Designcraft, Elevate, EUA, IPM Institute, McKinstry, Madison Metro Sewerage District, and Round Trip. Can we give them all a round of applause, please? And a big thank you to all of our members. You all make such a huge difference in us being able to do programs at our leaf levels, our tree levels, and our forest levels. The Sustain Dane membership is about education and professional development, connections through those networking and volunteering, and also through customized resources and support. You also get complimentary access to programs like this one today as a member. So please consider joining the Sustained Day membership and also consider supporting businesses and organizations that value sustainability. I'm going to go through a couple of our upcoming programs in case you haven't been eagle eye on the newsletter. Next week is the Big Share. On March 3rd, we're going to have a gathering at Greater Heights Climbing Gym. You can come to hang out and socialize like this, and also if you want to, try out climbing walls. So that will be next Tuesday. We have a volunteer event with the River Food Pantry on Wednesday, March 15th. Our Accelerate Sustainability Workshop, this is our workshop for businesses and organizations to put together plans for sustainability actions. That will be on Friday, April 17th. It's a half day. And the next day after that is our Earth Month cleanup. That's Saturday, April 18th. Where in past years we've collected over 800 pounds of trash because we do weigh it. So we need lots of volunteers. So come out if you are available. And last but not least, you are the first group to know, hot off the press, the summit date is finalized. Mark your calendar for Friday, November 6th at the Monona Terrace. So with that, I'd like to introduce my team member, Sonali, who will welcome our speaker and start the program today.
So before we get started, we wanted to acknowledge an important part of changing weather that we're not going to be able to fully explore in today's presentation. While planning this program, we made an effort to reach out to speakers who could speak directly on how changing weather and climate change disproportionately affects people in our community with the least resources, including people experiencing homelessness. We spoke with several organizations, but a lot of them are at capacity right now, so we weren't able to have them come out and speak on it. And we feel it's important to acknowledge that climate change does disproportionately affect people experiencing homelessness, and Sustained Dane is committed to continuing to share resources and having conversations about this. So after the program, Sustained Dane will send out an email, a follow-up email that will include resources on how to support, engage, and learn more about this. And now I'll hand it over to Amanda to give our presentation.
Thank you, Sonali. Thank you for inviting me here, Sustained Dane. I'm actually going to stand on this side, if that's okay, so I'm not looking right into the sun. My name is Amanda Latham. I am a climate outreach specialist with the State Climate Office. I was formerly a broadcast meteorologist here in Madison, so if I look vaguely familiar, that might be why. I worked at Channel 15, and now happy to be with the Climate Office. So today we'll be talking about how we're weathering our changing climate here in Wisconsin, some of the changes that we're seeing, the impacts of those as well. So to start things off, has anyone heard of either the Wisconsin State Climate Office or just a state climate office in general before? A couple. So we've actually been around since about the 50s. We've been around for a very long time, but we've kind of gone back and forth with and without funding. Thankfully now we have funding, and so we were able to add some people to our staff, including myself, and kind of expand on the resources that we're able to provide. So our mission as the Wisconsin State Climate Office is to offer climate services that help Wisconsinites use weather and climate information most effectively. So what exactly does that mean? How do we do that? We have our three main pillars: providing users with reliable weather and climate information. An emphasis on the reliable there. We want to make sure it's as accurate as possible, giving them records that date back well into the 1900s, sometimes even into the 1800s, if that's relevant to what they're looking for. We want to make sure it's coming from good data sources to make sure that that data is reliable for them. Also, interpretation. So instead of just throwing that information at people, we want to help them interpret it. So sometimes it's just an insurance agent reaching out to us asking about where hail fell in a certain spot to verify a claim that they got. They just need that data. But if it's a farmer asking about flooding trends in a certain county or in a certain region of the state, we can give them that information, but then also help them interpret that information so they can actually use it and apply it to their life and potentially improve their livelihood. Also, investigation. Not every state climate office does research, but our office is lucky that we are. We have about 3 people that do research. We conduct basic and applied research into Wisconsin's climate. One hot topic that we're trying to look into is Wisconsin getting windier? A lot of people have thought that the state is getting windier, it's gustier, they're getting more wind damage in a lot of areas, so that's something we're looking into, and it's actually a lot more complicated than we originally thought. So that's something that's turned into a research project for our office. So when I say we provide climate information, I do think it's important to say what is that climate information? What exactly do I mean by that? Because some people can have different ideas. So our office mostly focuses on where Wisconsin's climate is right now and where we have been in the past. So we look at records, as I mentioned, from the 1900s back into the mid-1800s, and we analyze those trends up until where Wisconsin is right now. We don't really get into Wisconsin's future climate. That's another group that we do closely partner with. It's called WICI, the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts. I'm actually a part of WICI. It's mostly a volunteer organization from people at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and then also the state DNR office. But we do try to keep these two a little bit separate. So mostly we focus on the past. My colleagues like to call us the weather historians or the weather librarians. WICI focuses a bit more on the future of where we could go in Wisconsin's climate. So we talked a little bit in the beginning, in the introduction, about some changes that have been seen. Things getting warmer in February, maybe not as much snow, no snow days. So just opening it up to you all, are there any big changes that you've noticed in Wisconsin's climate in the recent years, maybe even just in this year, some things that seem unusual to you? Yeah?
There was a tornado in February last year.
Yes, the first ever February tornado in Wisconsin, at least on record. So now there's been a tornado in every month of the year in the state. Anyone else? Yeah, in the back.
What happened up in Bayfield last week? There was like a snowstorm with lightning, I heard. I mean, it was crazy.
I don't think there was lightning in that storm, but it was a huge snowstorm in northern Wisconsin. But then the southern edge of that storm, closer towards Green Bay, there were thunderstorms there. So it was kind of in different areas of the state. But yeah, kind of split with winter on the northern side of that storm and then kind of spring thunderstorms on the southern side. Anyone else, any changes that you've seen? Yeah.
Bluebirds, there's a cohort of bluebirds that don't migrate anymore. They stay around all winter.
Interesting. I haven't heard that one before. Yeah.
As one who does controlled burns, 20 years ago, we maybe did a controlled burn at the end of March. Now that's mid-season, late season. We're doing our first burns at the beginning of March and even into February.
Yeah. So
Just over 20 years.
Big changes in a short period of time, yeah. I would say the biggest changes I've noticed, I've taken up cross-country skiing in the last couple of years. 2021 was a very snowy winter in Wisconsin, so I got into cross-country skiing. Haven't had a lot of luck the past couple of years because there hasn't been enough snow, or there's just been enough snow for just a couple days. They get the trails groomed, and then everything melts. Also, the air quality issues that we've had in recent summers, it's becoming a lot more common. The air quality getting worse and worse. This past summer, we had the most air quality alerts on record in Wisconsin. I believe there were 23 or 24, and I think one of those stretched over 6 or 7 days. So prolonged periods of very poor air quality from that wildfire smoke in Canada. So a lot of different changes. Some of them we'll get into a little bit more. Here's an outline of what we'll talk about today. First, we'll start off with kind of the basics to make sure we're all kind of on the same level, the same baseline of distinguishing weather and climate. And then we'll get into how Wisconsin's climate is changing, what are the impacts of that, and then a quick wrap up of some action items for you. So, what is climate? It's very often talked about as the average weather of a place, which is an okay way to talk about climate. So here's a little graph that shows the averages for Madison. This little brown curve here, that is the average throughout the year, the normal temperature range from January through the end of the year. The light blue is the record cold, the red is the record warm, and then each blue line here is a day. The top of that line is the high temperature of that day, and the bottom of that line, the low temperature of that day. So you can see a couple days where the top of that blue line is over or very close to that red mark, meaning that we tied or broke a record high. So that is the average for Madison. So thinking about the average weather of a place, what is the location outside of Wisconsin do you think their climate would be most similar to Madison?
Siberia.
Siberia. Interesting. Any reason for that?
Well, it's kind of in the middle now. Northern hemisphere.
Yeah. Any other guesses people want to throw out?
Moscow.
Moscow. Any reason behind that?
Same thing. It's about the same latitude.
Mm-hmm. Would anyone have guessed Cheyenne, Wyoming?
Yeah.
maybe not. They're not too different in terms of latitude in Madison. You can see the curves kind of similar to what we have in Madison. But if we look at actual dates, this is the high temperature on February 1st of this year. Madison had a high of 26, Cheyenne had a high of 57. And if we go a little bit earlier, January 9th, Madison had a high of 56 when Cheyenne had a high of 27. So there are definitely some big differences when we take a closer look at the weather that both of these places see. So yes, the averages might be very, very similar, but the actual weather that's experienced can be very different. So instead of talking about climate as the average weather of a place, we like to talk about it as the accumulation of weather or the accumulated weather of a place so that it counts for that day-to-day variability. It does account for those big extremes, those 60-degree temperatures in February, 50-degree temperatures in January. It doesn't sway that accumulation of weather quite as much, but it still includes them. The average kind of flattens those things out. So we talk about it as the accumulated weather of a place. So what is weather versus climate? Some of you are probably pretty familiar with this, but weather changes day to day, hour to hour. Climate is the accumulation of those changes. So how I talk to this with kids, if you're trying to talk with someone about weather versus climate, we use the mood versus personality analogy. So your mood changes day to day, hour to hour, maybe minute to minute. If you're having a bad day, your personality is the accumulation of those moods. And it's normal for your personality to change over time. Your personality right now may not be the personality you had 20 years ago. You've grown, you've changed. Things in your life have changed your personality, and that is normal, which is why it's normal for climate to change. But we don't want to confuse weather events with climate trends. And so, how would you gauge a change in someone's personality? You wouldn't just meet with them one time and say that is their personality. You would look at them over multiple months, multiple years. So when we're talking about climate, we tend to look at least 30-year periods so we can get a good idea of the climate of a place. If we take too small of a sample, we might be getting kind of an outlier. If we take a huge sample, we can get a better idea of that climate. So what shapes our weather and climate in Wisconsin? The topography, the soil, and the vegetation. All of that determines how water flows through the landscape, how it's absorbed by the landscape, and how it's retained by the landscape. Certain soils dry out a lot faster than other soils. Some soils retain heat a lot easier than other soils. Vegetation plays a huge part in how that water and heat are absorbed into the landscape. So that really shapes our weather and climate in Wisconsin, but then also in the entire United States. All of those things are true on a larger scale. So of course we think of the South as very warm, very humid. A lot of that has to do with how close they are to the Gulf of Mexico. All of that warm and humid air going onshore, adding a lot of humidity to those southern states. The Central Plains often heat up very, very quickly in the spring. They get a lot of strong thunderstorms out there as things heat up very fast. A lot of that has to do with the dry air coming out of the Rockies. That dry air goes out over the plains. Dry air heats up a lot faster than humid air. It's a lot easier to raise that temperature if there's not water in it. If you're kind of thinking of in terms of lakes cool down slower in the fall. They take longer to heat up in the spring and summer. Same thing for air. And so all of that shapes the climate of the United States and determines how consistent a place's climate is or how extreme a climate is. This is kind of an old map, but this is the difference between the hottest heat index of the year and the coldest wind chill of a year. So if we have those lighter green colors, that's a smaller difference between those two extremes. So the West Coast, not much change. Their climate is pretty consistent. Los Angeles has a pretty similar forecast every single day. The South also doesn't see huge changes, but a little bit more than the West Coast. But in the central and northern parts of the United States, we get some of that hot, humid air from the south and also from the west, but then we also get that extreme cold from the north. And so we get those more extreme conditions. So that really shapes our weather and climate, all of those different geographical elements. But it is clear that the climate of the United States is changing. This is the number of billion-dollar disasters that have occurred in each state from 1980 to 2024. The darker the red, the more billion-dollar disasters. So Texas has seen the most with about 150 since 1980. Wisconsin has seen about 63, and that was up until 2024. So it doesn't include anything from last year. But it's also important to look at the time scale of these. Going back to 1980, maybe about 5 to 10 per year, but then there's been a huge increase through the 2010s and then into the 2020s. Now 20 to $25 billion disasters per year annually. So we know that we are straying a lot further from normal everywhere, but also in Wisconsin. So one thing that our office has developed is called an extreme weather index. We call it the EWI, which weighs the temperature and precip anomalies, so how far they are from historic normal for a time period. So that could be a month, that could be a season, that can be a year. So if a month is pretty close to average, that would be a low EWI, closer to 0. If a month was super, super wet, super, super cold, that would be a high EWI, a very extreme month, closer to 100. So we've looked at how the EWI of every county has changed since 1895 on the annual time scale. And so the darker the red color, the more percent change that's been seen in most of those counties. And so southern Wisconsin has seen an increase in extreme weather, especially, the entire state has, but about a 40 to 60% increase in the extreme weather index in a lot of those counties. Dodge County is the one that has seen the most, with close to about a 60% increase since 1895. And so we're straying further from normal, and that's having a lot of impacts in a lot of different ways. More tornadoes in February, air pollution, low snow, especially in the north, which impacts just recreational ski events, but then also those ski resorts, the Birkebeiner as well. More flooding, water temperatures near record warm conditions. So all of these have a lot of different impacts, and there are a lot of different changes that are causing these impacts. So we know that Wisconsin is getting warmer. This is the annual temperature by decade. The 30s and 40s were actually very warm, but the 2000s and 2010s were by far the warmest for Wisconsin. Now the forecast for the 2020s is to be much, much warmer than those record warm decades, with an annual temperature of about 45 degrees, which is significantly warmer than all of those other temperatures. So how are we getting warmer? We're warming across all seasons in Wisconsin, but it differs by the rate of warming. So this is the change in the average daily high temperature for each season. So that daily high, how has that changed? Winter, we've seen the most warming with about 3 to 5 degree increase in that high temperature for most of Wisconsin. Summer, we've actually seen the lowest amount of change. Wisconsin has not seen an increase in the number of 90-degree days since 1950. That's actually just kind of been a consistent trend since 1950. Not a big change in those summer high temperatures. But we can also look at low temperatures. Low temperatures overnight are warming a lot faster than those daytime temperatures, especially during winter, and especially in northern Wisconsin. We're in those darker reds, so about 7 to 9 degree temperature difference compared to 1950 in northern Wisconsin. Across spring, summer, and fall, more consistent changes, but still more significant than that daytime temperature change, an increase of about 3 to 4 degrees across most Wisconsin counties for those low temperatures. So we're losing that overnight cold, especially in the winter. And so that means our coldest conditions aren't as cold as what they used to be. So this graph here is showing the coldest condition in Wisconsin in any given year. So we look back at one year, what place saw the coldest temperature, and we put that on this graph, all the way back to 1885. You can see there is a significant upward trend. The coldest annual temperature for Wisconsin has warmed by about 8 degrees since 1885, and that is a very big change. But when we're talking about this, you may think back to what we had in January, the coldest conditions in Wisconsin since 2019. So that was an extreme outbreak of cold air. So why did we have that if our cold temperatures aren't as cold as what they used to be? So a little off trail into the polar vortex, because I know a lot of people talk about it and don't always understand it. So what is the polar vortex? It is a low pressure center. If you've ever seen a weather map with the lows and the highs, it's a very strong low pressure center up over the North Pole, and it contains very, very cold Arctic air. Now to the south, you see the polar jet stream, which kind of acts as a fence or a little barrier to keep all of that cold air up in the Arctic. And so this is what a strong, stable polar vortex looks like. When the polar vortex is strong, it typically doesn't impact the United States. It's when the polar vortex is weak that it starts to impact the United States or other areas that typically don't see that Arctic cold. So when the polar vortex is wavy and weak, it has a harder time containing all of that cold air, and that can start to sag southward. So I like to think of it as swirling a lasso. If you're swirling it really, really fast, that rope is almost a perfect circle. But if you start to slow down and you're not as confident as you're swirling that rope, it starts to get a little bit more wavy and wobbly, and that's when we can get that cold air sinking farther south. So what causes that to happen? Something called sudden stratospheric warming. We won't get into that right now, but it's when things suddenly warm up in the Arctic, and it throws things off balance. And so it's important to think about when we have a weaker vortex, not containing all of that cold, it's more likely to seep into the United States, and the Arctic is warming about 2 to 4 times faster than the rest of the globe, which means there could be more sudden stratospheric warming events happening and continuing to disrupt that polar vortex. So when we have a warmer Arctic, we typically have a weaker vortex. So even though our extreme cold isn't as extreme as it used to be, we could potentially see more bursts of this very cold air, which is very, very cold to us, but the actual intensity of that cold probably won't be as great as it was back into the mid-1900s, if that makes sense. So since we're losing that extreme cold, especially in the winter, that means we have a shorter lake ice season on the Great Lakes. Lake Superior has lost an average of almost 50 days of lake ice coverage since 1970, just over 20 days for Lake Michigan. And of course, this has huge impacts. Lakeshore erosion has become a huge issue. Lake ice is very important along the shoreline to protect the shoreline from those winter storms that kick up those very big waves and keeps them further off from shore and prevents that erosion. It's also very important for some fish species. They will lay their eggs along the shoreline in the fall. That ice develops and protects those eggs from those big winter storms, from the currents of the lake, pulling them out into the lake. But without that ice, or with shorter periods of that ice, those eggs are more likely to get pulled out, and then we have lower fish populations. Shipping industry, potentially good news there, as we have less lake ice. Some companies are considering year-round Great Lake shipping, as there's just not as much ice to battle, or that ice is thinner and easier to break up. Of course, we have impacts on the local lakes as well. Our office has been keeping records of Lake Mendota and Lake Monona ice coverage since about 1850. So a very, very long record of lake ice. And since 1971, Lake Mendota has lost almost a month of ice coverage. Lake Monona, just over 2 weeks of ice coverage has been lost on average. And so, of course, there are changes locally as well. If you remember in 2024, the Winter Carnival, they moved Lady Liberty on land, which obviously didn't look as nice as it does on the lake. And also not as many people going to see it because it's just not as exciting. More people falling into the lakes as well, as they're expecting that ice to be thick and safe by a certain point of the year. But with those warmer temperatures, that ice is either thinner or it's just not safe for as long as it should be. And so with these warming temperatures, we have shifting seasons. So the growing season has shifted significantly. The last freeze of spring is coming over 2 weeks earlier than it used to, and the first freeze of fall is coming over 2 weeks later than it used to. So growing seasons have really lengthened in Wisconsin. We have more freeze and frost-free time with those changes. So Eau Claire has seen the smallest amount of change. They're that light green line, only an increase of about 8 days since 1970. But Madison, this light blue line, has seen an increase of about 34 days on average for that growing season. So a much, much longer growing season. But that also means that we're seeing warmer temperatures in spring, then the summer temperatures also start earlier. So summer heat is starting to bleed into spring and fall a lot more. If you remember this past October, we had 90-degree heat for the first week or two. Green Bay even got up to 89 degrees, which I believe was their record warmest October temperature. And so that summer heat really not letting us go and lasting a whole lot longer, which then shrinks that winter season, everything just kind of compressing as that summer season is expanding. And so what are the impacts of this? The growing season is getting longer, which you might think is great for farmers because they have more time to get out into the fields, more time to get that harvest in, but that also means they're facing new challenges with pests because the pests also emerge earlier as that freeze is melting or lifting sooner and not happening as quickly in the fall. So pests lasting longer, emerging earlier. Also, sometimes they're able to get multiple generations in a season, which can make them more resistant to pesticide and treatment. So then more challenges for those farmers to face. Cattle begin to feel heat stress at about 70 degrees. And so as we stay warmer overnight, especially in the summer, they continue with that heat stress and that actually lowers dairy production by about 30%. Plants also feel a certain type of heat stress when temperatures stay warm overnight. They kind of use more energy to keep themselves cool and comfortable, which means during the day they have less energy to put towards growing, and so that can reduce crop yields. Also, you may have noticed some species of plants re-blooming again in the fall. I've noticed it a lot with lilacs, blooming again in October, which can be great. It looks very nice, but then we get a freeze, kills those plants, damages those plants if they're not really prepared for that freeze. Also means it could decrease the number of blooms that you see the following spring. So we're getting warmer, and we are also getting wetter. The 2010s was by far Wisconsin's wettest decade on record. 2020s is expected to still be high, but not quite as high, right around 32 inches for that annual average. So we're seeing wetter conditions for most across all seasons. So winter especially is getting wetter, almost about 20% wetter on average since 1950. Similar trends in spring and fall, but an interesting shift in summer where northern Wisconsin has started to get drier. And we're not going to get much into future projections, but Wisconsin is expected to see those dry summer conditions spread throughout the state in the summer months as we go into the next few decades. So they're starting to see that in northern Wisconsin. Southern Wisconsin could soon see that change as well. Has anyone heard the term 100-year rains or 100-year event? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods, some hands raised. There's a little confusion sometimes about what that means. People think it means the frequency of an event. It will happen once every 100 years. It's actually the probability of that event. So a 1 in 100 chance that an event of that size or that magnitude would occur in that year in a certain place. And so from 2010 to 2019, Wisconsin had 21 100-year rainfall events occur. And this isn't my favorite map. It can be a little confusing, but the contour that we're looking at here is the rainfall amount that would correspond to a 100-year event in that place. So it does differ across the state depending on the historical averages, the climate of that place. So it takes less for northeastern Wisconsin to get a 100-year rainfall event, only about 4 to 5 inches, whereas southern Wisconsin, typically wetter in general, takes a bit more to get to that 100-year rainfall event criteria. So that's what we're looking at with the contours. But what's interesting is all of these white boxes are actual 100-year events that happened between 2010 and 2019. So I'm sure many of you remember the August 2018 flooding event in Madison. 11.6 inches fell on the west side, and it only needed to be 6 inches of rainfall to qualify as that 100-year rainfall event. So we're seeing more of these very large rainfall events happening, but then they're far exceeding the criteria for these 100-year rains. And these, of course, have massive impacts on housing, as houses flood, as garages flood, as roads are washed out, especially in those smaller communities where they have fewer resources. I was actually talking with someone that lived up in Ashland County in 2016. They also had another big flood in 2018. and he said there were roads that were completely washed out for months, and there aren't a lot of alternative roads to get to some places up in far northern Wisconsin. And so he said there were just some places you couldn't go to for a couple months. You couldn't get to this certain town for a couple months because those roads were washed out. And so events like this have become a lot more common in Wisconsin in recent years. And then, of course, the 1,000-year flood, so the 0.1% chance of happening in Milwaukee, and it did happen this past August 9th of 2025, when 14.5 inches of rain fell at a high school on the North Metro side of Milwaukee. That did set a new state record for Wisconsin for the largest single-day rainfall event. And I believe that number will go up in the coming years, but an estimated $76 million in damage was done there, and a lot of people had health concerns as well, a lot of visits to the emergency department, either due to mold that's now growing in their home, carbon monoxide poisoning as well, just general damages. So a lot's happening with things getting wetter. However, on the flip side, we've also become drier in some areas. So we're seeing more of these really extreme droughts, if you've noticed that. If you remember the summer and fall of 2023, this is the drought monitor from September 5th of 2023. This was the most widespread severe drought in Wisconsin on record. Those records do only go back to 2000 for the Wisconsin Drought Monitor, but still a very significant drought. So the darker the color here, the worse the drought is. So anywhere in red is considered an extreme drought. In that dark maroon brown color, that's an exceptional drought. And that doesn't happen very frequently in Wisconsin. And that ended up being the state's 5th driest summer on record. So we're seeing these really wet events, these really heavy rainfall events, but then really dry periods in between. This is something our office has called the precip ping pong, where we're going back and forth between these two extremes. What we're looking at here is the departure from normal for precipitation in Wisconsin for every month from 2015 to 2025. So for a given month, how above average or below average were they in terms of precipitation? And so there's a lot of fluctuation, but I've highlighted a couple here where we went from way above average precip to over an inch wetter than average to over an inch drier than average just a couple months later. So very extreme flipping between those two things. So yes, we're getting wetter, but a lot of that precip is coming in just a couple events. It's not spread out over time, which also means the landscape doesn't absorb it as well. A lot of it runs off. And so it's not really beneficial, steady, consistent rainfall. It's all in one burst, and then we're dry for a long period of time. And so this is creating a lot of challenges for a lot of people in general gardeners, but especially people that work in agriculture. New challenges in terms of when to plant. If you remember 2024, we had a very, very wet spring, but then a very, very dry summer. So a lot of farmers, especially in northern Wisconsin, either risked it and put their seed in early when it was still very, very wet and ended up losing some of that because it all washed away. Others risked it in the other way and waited until things dried out and risked a shorter growing period. They waited a little bit too long and put their seed in after things had dried out, and then it was pretty dry through the summer. So there's really no winning in that situation. Also, I learned about slugs a couple weeks ago. During that summer, northern Wisconsin had a huge issue with slugs because it was so wet that summer. Slugs love moisture, but they do not respond to any known pesticides. And that wasn't an issue that northern Wisconsin had seen. And so there really wasn't much that they knew that they could do in terms of slugs. They were just eating all of the crop. And so new pests are emerging. Also, calves that are born in the spring, especially if it's very, very wet, their hooves get very soft if they're standing in water too long, and a lot of them are more prone to illnesses in the very wet weather. And so a lot of new challenges and really just unpredictability that those farmers are having to face with these new challenges, not knowing if it's going to be a very dry summer, a very wet summer, or it's just changing from month to month, very unpredictable growing seasons, even though those growing seasons are technically getting longer. And so our key takeaways for you: Wisconsin is getting warmer, especially during the winter and especially at night, especially those winter nights, getting a lot warmer. but we're getting those warmer conditions during the nights, spring, summer, and fall as well. Wisconsin overall is getting wetter, but we still get those really severe dry periods. And we're expected to see drier conditions in the summer in the future as we go towards about mid-century 2024 to 2060. And Wisconsin's climate is becoming more extreme. We're seeing more of those extreme swings, more of those extreme temperatures in winter, and some of those extreme temperatures at night in summer as well. So those are our key takeaways. What can you do? I like this quote, "Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending." And that is from climate scientist Kate Marvel. So climate can sometimes feel very intimidating, like we're a small piece in a very large global puzzle, but it's important to still do your part and make sure that you're doing as much as you can. So these are some organizations in Wisconsin that are really moving towards climate action. 350 Wisconsin, also Clean Wisconsin, really focused on pollution. Both of them send out newsletters and have calls to action. Healthy Climate Wisconsin is more focused on public health and towards healthcare providers, but also a very good resource as well. You can also be citizen scientists. In the current day and age, it's very important to get local data from people and making sure that we have a lot of different sources of data. So you can report nature observations with the National Phenology Network. So it's as simple as reporting, I saw the first robin in my neighborhood. Hummingbirds are back in my neighborhood. I saw monarch butterflies returning to my neighborhood. That can help track the changing in migration patterns across the United States. CoCoRa's, the Community Collective Rain, Hail, and Snow Network, is a great way to collect rainfall reports, hail reports, snow reports as well across the state of Wisconsin. You do have to buy a specific rain gauge for that so they can make sure everyone's using the same equipment, but that is a very valuable resource for our office, but then also the National Weather Service. Broadcast meteorologists use that data as well. And then Water Action Volunteers can help you monitor water quality in your neighborhood. They will actually train you to take water samples and on how to best monitor water quality in your neighborhood. Staying informed is also very important, making sure you're getting your climate information from great resources. I'm sure many of you are, but here are a couple of sources. NOAA.gov/climate. It used to be climate.gov, but that website was shut down, and some of those resources have been pushed to this one, and they do still post some pretty good updates there as well. ClimateCentral.org is a great resource. I use a lot of their information. They're very good at posting relevant topics. They posted about the Olympics and how there's a decreasing number of places that can host the Winter Olympics with our changing climate. So very interesting, very topical posts from them. And of course, the plug for our office's websites, climatology.nelson.wisc.edu. I'll also have some pamphlets and some bookmarks if you want to learn more about our office. We post monthly, seasonal, and annual climate summaries that look across the entire state of Wisconsin. What was the average precip in that area, average temperatures, what were some big events that happened, and putting those events in historical context. And we do have a newsletter that you can also subscribe to. You can do that on our website. We have two different blogs, the Wisconsin Climate Chronicles, where we talk about weather outlooks for the season or for the month, and put those in historical context as well. We talk about the anniversaries of big events and also recap recent events like that Arctic blast we saw in late January and put that in historical context to talk about really how significant was that event, and that one was very significant. Another one, a little bit more of a deep dive for these, is climate education. One of our assistant state climatologists does this, and he is a breadth of knowledge. So, for example, talking about why is Wisconsin so good for growing cranberries? How does our climate make Wisconsin prime for cranberries? Talking about the gales of November, of course, the Edmund Fitzgerald, but also other big early November storms on the Great Lakes, and different apples in Wisconsin, how they respond to Wisconsin's climate. So some more niche topics there. So here's the contact information for our office, phone number, my email, our office's email as well. If you ever have questions, you want data from us, we'd be happy to provide that for you, happy to answer those questions. If there's ever a blog that you'd like us to write something about, a topic you want to learn more about, we'd be happy to look into that for you. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Amanda. Before we move into Q&A, we actually have some time reserved for discussion questions. So if you could hit the next slide for me. Going back to Claire's initial talking points, how can we stretch these conversations about the weather? Because there are everyday entry points. I feel like it's a go-to conversation starter that we can bring up with anyone. To conversations about climate change or the actions that we're taking around the climate. For instance, I was at the dentist last week on Friday, and I walked like a couple blocks to it, and it was really windy. It was sleeting in my face on the way over, and then we talked about that there and how 2 weeks ago it was just in the 60s in February, and that gave me the opportunity to share that we have this upcoming program, the work that I do, and then I can connect that to an action that maybe not seem totally direct to the weather, but everything kind of contributes to the weather, like shopping locally, signing up for a newsletter that then you could share with someone, using reusable napkins so you're reducing your waste, things like that. So we're going to take about 8 or 10 minutes to talk at your tables about this question, connecting weather experiences and how they play a role in our conversations about climate change. We'll do a couple share outs and then have a few minutes for Q&A at the end. Awesome. Thank you. Discuss.
So it's one of the opportunities I found over the years is, as you said, right? A lot of people like to talk about the weather. It's a social thing. What I've enjoyed doing is to take the contrarian view, because whenever it's middle of winter and it gets warm, everyone says, "Oh, it's great, it's nice and warm there." But I'm a winter sports enthusiast, so you take the contrarian view and it really gets people's attention when you talk about passionately about winter sports.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sorry.
So I, for the last year and a half, I'm in my last week, but the last year and a half I worked with a foundation called Couillard Solar Foundation. And I have never worked in solar before. I am from an insurance background. So I learned a ton about emergency preparedness, especially for communities, which I had never thought about before then. So everybody's experienced a weather or climate situation that they either know somebody who's been through a tornado or they've experienced a flood themselves. But what I have learned is, for instance, Sun Prairie Library is now a hub. It's a resilience hub. So if something goes wrong in a neighboring community or even theirs, where they lose power to the grid, they have EV charging stations. They have warming area for people. They have all sorts of contacts set up with the different emergency providers throughout the community. So that's something that, again, it wasn't on my radar beforehand, but now is a conversation that I'm having more and more. It blew my mind when I first heard about resilience hubs, and so I do try and share that as much as possible.
That's great. Thank you. One more share out from the conversations that we had. 2 hands at once. You're closer, Steve.
No, there's somebody else. We talked a little bit about how we all look at weather differently. I brought up the topic, I might be an engineer that understands stormwater and these 100-year storm events and what that comes from. We might have somebody that loves to be in the outdoors and hunt or snowmobile and how they approach weather. So I think having these conversations, we have to be curious with each other, how it impacts us differently. And you don't have to be an environmentalist to care about the weather, right? You don't have to be someone that works in climate change industry to care about the weather. People that are in the industry of, hotels and restaurants up north where cross-country skiing and snowmobiling is a big industry. And we want to have those industries in the future. And there's been winters where there's not been enough snow for those folks to be able to go up there. So hotels don't get business through their busiest season. So I encourage everybody to be curious in their conversations. Let go of judgment a little bit about, how people approach it or whether they believe in it or not, and just have those conversations.
Awesome, thank you. We can also move into some Q&A now. So if there's any questions that were sparked based on this presentation, anything you want to ask our wonderful speaker today, I'll walk the mic around for those as well.
First off, thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation today, and great analogies as well.
Thank you.
I had two questions for you, actually. One, is there any reason behind why Dodge County has such an extreme difference than every other county in the state?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure. I would think part of it is their closeness to the lake, either adding very warm conditions in the fall. Of course, the lake kind of moderates things closer to the lake shore, but sometimes Dodge County can be just on the edge of that, so that can cause them to be a little bit warmer in the fall or maybe a little bit cooler in the spring. They're just far enough north, especially of Madison, to get a little bit more of that snow, potentially get more of those rain events that miss Madison and go closer towards Green Bay. So I think they're just kind of in that sweet middle spot where they're just close enough to the lake, just far enough north, but then just far enough south.
God, don't move to Dodge County. My second question for you is about the lake ice and the days off. Now, does that mean no ice on the lake at all, or are you just talking like open water and ice along the shore? I just didn't know what that difference was.
Yeah, so for the Great Lakes, I should have specified that's any ice on the Great Lakes, since the Great Lakes don't usually become completely ice covered. For Lake Mendota and Lake Mendota, that's complete ice coverage. So how long that lake is completely ice covered.
All right, cool. I lied. I have one more quick question. It means I was really paying attention to you.
Yeah, that's good.
When you talk about the billion-dollar disasters that have increased over time, is there any account, I'm not discounting anything, but is like just the cost of everything gone up? Is that factored into that at all? Because obviously,
yes,
a huge complex that needs to be rebuilt now is 20 times more expensive than it was in 1980.
Definitely, and also there are more things to be damaged now than there were in 1980. Rural areas are becoming more developed, so there's more opportunities for things to become damaged. So yes, that's definitely an impact. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I asked you this beforehand, but I'm going to ask you this in the bigger area. You were a TV meteorologist, and were fun. I enjoyed watching you on TV. Why don't TV meteorologists talk more about global warming and climate change in their 5-minute presentations?
That is a very good question. I got it a lot when I was in TV. A couple different reasons. When you're giving the TV forecast, you usually have 2 minutes, 30 seconds, 3 minutes, so you have a very short amount of time to get your forecast out. So 3 minutes goes by very, very quickly. So you have certain things you need to talk about in that 3-minute span. Also, at least for me, I feel that climate is often a very two-way conversation. On TV, I'm not always talking to a group like you who are already aware that climate is an issue. You're talking to people all across the state that have very different views. And so if I'm just throwing information up there about how Wisconsin's climate is changing, they're not having the opportunity to respond to me, and then I can't respond to them. They're automatically just thinking, oh, well, that's not true. Oh, I don't believe that. Oh, Channel 15 is liberal media. They're getting that thought in their head, and I don't have the opportunity to talk with them about it and talk with them in a way that they would understand and relate it to things that they would understand. So for me, I felt like TV is a very one-way conversation. I'm just talking at you, you're receiving that information. Whereas climate, I feel like, is often better discussed with a broad audience as a two-way conversation.
Okay, we'll do one more question. Anybody that hasn't spoken today want to speak?
Okay, accountant here. I am wondering how the government changes in funding have affected the reliability of data, even from reliable sources like NOAA, all the way down to the funding of citizen science projects.
Yeah, that's a great question. So NCAR is a very big resource that funds and does a lot of research and development into developing weather models and weather model forecasting. And so if they will be shut down in the next couple of months, weather forecasting and weather model development will start to fall behind. So that's one thing that we're watching very closely. In terms of data collection, there are a lot of groups that are federally funded that cannot collect certain things anymore. For example, one of our partners is the Midwest Regional Climate Center, so they're kind of like the state climate office, but on a regional scale. They were federally funded, and they lost their funding for a couple months, and so we weren't able to get the data and resources that they provide. Thankfully, they got their funding back, and everything came back, but a scary couple months where we were trying to figure out what would we do if they don't come back, and what resources are available that will be permanently available that we can use to fill those gaps. And as I mentioned, some websites have gone down, not always ones that we would use, but ones that would inform the public. Climate.gov was a big one. They were very good at talking about climate and weather in very understandable ways, and kind of just making sure that everyone can understand those high-level climate and weather phenomena, and that has now gone away. So I think a lot of it is that information and that explanation is something that we've really lost, and so we're trying to find ways to keep that on our website, or other sites are trying to pick that up.
Awesome. Let's give a round of applause for Amanda today. I'll leave you with the thought that the next time you're talking about the weather with someone, either a coworker, friend, the dentist, if you have an appointment coming up soon, that you think about this question and how you can inspire them based on something that you do, an action that you're doing, so that they can maybe take that step too and think about it in a way with something that you learned today. So just keep that food for thought. And then a few wrap-up announcements just before we leave. There are feedback forms on the table if you want to give us your input. I will also send it in the follow-up email if you would like to give it digitally. The slides will also be included in that follow-up email, as well as the resources we talked about earlier, and Amanda's resources, as well as a recording of the program. Feel free to share that with a coworker or friend as well to spread the word. Name tags, we'll reuse the name tags, so go ahead and put those at the name tag table or leave them at your table here. Plates and cups can go by the sink, just beyond the wall there in the kitchen. We'll go ahead and put them in the dishwasher for you. Any food scraps that you have can be composted in the bins around, so just look for the compost bin and they can be placed there. And I hope to see you at an upcoming program. I think I hit it all. Staff's around if you have any questions, or feel free to mingle and network here. Amanda's going to stick around for a little bit to grab more coffee and breakfast snacks and hang out. Awesome. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.